Now let's go to Megan Fitzpatrick. She's been listening in live from the Ontario Legislature in Toronto. So Megan, many words shared there. What stands out for you?
Yeah, and just a bit more on the actual announcement, Michael, because another significant change they announced is eliminating the minimum wage rate for liquor services. They're basically going to, in this proposed legislation, get rid of that category and lump them in with the general minimum wage rate. Currently, liquor servers make $12.55 an hour, and the theory was that they get tips and that helps supplement their income, but the government's saying essentially that's not working for them, and they're starting in January also going to earn $15 an hour, and they're also adjusting the rates in the other minimum wage categories, like for students, for example, under 18, they'll make more come January as well. So that's the big announcement, but we have to talk about the background, of course, and what a big reversal this is for Premier Doug Ford. Back in 2018, the previous Liberal government under Premier Kathleen Wynne, they had a plan to get Ontario to $15 an hour for minimum wage. It was set to go to that rate in January 2019, and Doug Ford, when he was elected, scrapped that plan. He held minimum wage at $14 an hour for the next 2 years. Back then, he called that minimum wage raise a job killer, but he's now obviously changed his mind. He said things in that news conference, Michael, like our government couldn't agree more with the need to raise the minimum wage, but he couldn't agree less back in 2018. So that's why a lot of those questions focused on what changed. Why did you change your mind? And one of his answers was the pandemic, that things have changed. It's not the same kind of environment for workers now as it was in 2018. But one of the good questions there too was, well, if it wasn't for the pandemic, would you still be doing this then? Because, you know, again, the Premier was making comments like how these minimum wage workers deserve this money in their pocket. So his critics are going to say, Michael, they also deserved it back then, but the Premier refused to give it to them. That's what we heard from Andrea Horwath, the NDP leader, who raised this very question here at the legislature in question period yesterday, and Doug Ford gave no hints that this announcement was coming today. But Doug Ford talking about all the other things that he says his government has done to support workers in this province since taking over here as the government. He said, you know, when he was asked about the impact on businesses, many of whom are, of course, struggling through the pandemic as well. And again, he was talking about the support that business owners have gotten. And he says now it's time to support the workers. One of the most interesting parts of this news conference, of course, was to hear the words of thanks from those union leaders, with some of them acknowledging when Doug Ford got elected, they said some, quote, not nice things about him. I just have to emphasize what a rare thing this is to see union leaders like Jerry Dias and Smokey Thomas side by side with the Premier getting along like this and all on the same page when it comes to this one issue, though. So we heard Jerry Dias saying, yeah, this is great. Of course, we want a minimum wage rise to $15 an hour. But he also said that's not good enough. That's not a living wage, especially for people who live in places like here in Toronto. They need to be earning at least $16 an hour, really, to be making ends meet. And so he said, well, this is welcome news. He and his union counterparts will continue to push the Ford government for increases to wages and other measures like permanent paid sick days. Doug Ford said during that news conference that he has always been on the side of workers. And again, worth noting, when he did take power, along with scrapping the minimum wage hike, he also scrapped legislated 2 paid sick days. Now, we got rid of those. During the pandemic, those have come back after a lot of pressure during the third wave of the pandemic. But the sick days that are currently being provided, that business owners, employers are required to give, are temporary. The Ford government has not committed to making those permanent. We heard Jerry Dias say that's another thing that he will continue pushing the Premier for. But again, I feel like a lot of the criticism that he's probably going to get is, why didn't you do these things sooner? If you say you're on the side of workers, then you should be giving them permanent paid sick days. You should be giving those Oh, this is another thing that came up in the news conference. Personal support workers, for example, during the pandemic, their low wages certainly highlighted, and the Ford government has been giving them temporary pay increases for a couple months at a time. The most recent one they announced just last week, a $3 an hour pay raise that's now in place until March, I believe. And Premier Ford said during that news conference, and we've heard him say this before, that they want to make that permanent. We're going to hear his critics ask then, Michael, why aren't you doing it? What's taking so long? And another thing that came up in that news conference in terms of the timing of this announcement, it is not lost on anybody here at Queen's Park that an election in Ontario is a few months away. The cynical critics, he was asked, are saying that this is a ploy to get votes. And Doug Ford, of course, rejecting that notion and saying, no, it's not. He's doing this, essentially, he says, because it's the right thing to do and these workers deserve more money in their pockets.
Well, we certainly are tracking all the reaction, but again, as we said, Megan, the official announcement now coming down that the minimum wage in Ontario will be bumped up to $15 an hour come January the 1st. We'll speak again, but for now, thank you for this. Our Megan Fitzpatrick in Toronto.